It's my pleasure now to welcome our Fairlawn friend, Gordon Pitts, to tell us the story of Chris Newton, a computer science wizard and entrepreneur who's started his journey in New Brunswick at the University of New Brunswick. Welcome to Gordon. And this, of course, is based on his fantastic new book, Unicorn in the Woods. Over to you, Gord.
Unicorn in the Woods is what I was working on the past few years until it came out last September, and it's about a lot of really big themes: how to build value, how to build technology companies off the beaten path, not in Toronto or Vancouver, but in what's known as drive-through country. The United States has flyover country. We tend to denigrate areas that are off the beaten path. We call them drive-through areas. Place like New Brunswick or Saskatoon or Thunder Bay, you go through often on the way to somewhere else. But it's also an adventure story with a hero, a guy named Chris Newton. That's not a contemporary picture of Chris, by the way. But this is Chris as a kid. And we all know kids like Chris, obsessed with computer games, fixated on screens. This is in the 1990s, even in the 1990s. He spent too much time in his room working on playing with a computer, but a good kid, no trouble to his family. There's no sign of drugs. He was the kind of kid, his mom says, that you could trust him to take a carload of kids from rural New Brunswick to the big bad city of Moncton, and they wouldn't get into any trouble. He was a good kid, and he was also very curious about how things worked, not just computers, but cars, fishing boats, fishing lines, fishing reels. He could be any kid. He could be your kid. He could be your niece. He could be your nephew. He's what is often called a nerd. And he didn't mind that at all. People remember Chris growing up in the Miramichi region of New Brunswick. And the Miramichi, if you can see this, there's the Miramichi, the municipality of the Miramichi. But the Miramichi is a river and a river system that crawls right through the center of New Brunswick. It's a huge area in terms of its drawing power. And you can see other parts. It's a bit of a ways from Miramichi to Fredericton and down to St. John. The other major city being, of course, Moncton over here. So that's sort of the layout. And people remember Chris as a shy kid, maybe the least likely to be famous, to stand out in a crowd. The least likely person to become a giant in technology in Atlantic Canada and even Canada. He was born in the Miramichi, into this big area here, particularly in the town of Miramichi and the village of Newcastle. And it was the center of the great maritime timber trade of the 1800s. It's become more recently an area of old mills, often being shut down, wonderful salmon streams and luxurious fishing camps of the well-to-do, but also of economic struggle, a bit isolated with a lot of economic challenges. And if you've read the novels of David Adams Richards, you could see the grim blow, but also a very beautiful part of the world with resilient people. And he was the son of a police chief in the Miramichi, actually the police chief of Newcastle. And Chris grew up in that environment. He was exposed to his dad's life and his dad's work. Chris always liked to tinker. This is, by the way, is Chris over here. This is Dan, his dad. And I'm trying to remember his sister's name, but being at my age, even though I know it well, I can't remember at the time. And there's his mom, Patty. Chris always liked to tinker, and he would be, around time when he was 4, his mom tells the story about everything being very quiet in the house, and she crept down to the basement and found Chris had taken his toy truck, and he'd put it up on blocks, and he had climbed underneath it with his dad's tools, and he was taking it apart. He was just that kind of kid. But he also loved the wide open rural landscape of the province. Now, one dark and defining moment for Chris, I found out, was in the late 80s, 1989, when Ellen Legere, serial killer, went on a rampage across the Miramichi and leaving it really a ghastly tale of death and torture, 5 murders in which he had a hand. And there was a huge manhunt at that time involving Chris's father, Dan. And it went over 7 months. And Legere was known as the monster of the Miramichi. Now, Chris's dad would bring the other officers for meetings to Chris's house, to the Newtons' house. And over the dining room table, they would plan the tactics of the day, how to catch this man. And Chris would watch, and he soaked it all in. He acquired a focus on bringing bad people to justice, be they criminals or hackers who were bringing down computer systems. He was never a policeman like his dad, but he had that sense of law and order. Dan was away quite a bit at night. And one day he was away leaving his wife, Patty, and Chris. And it just happened their grandparents, Chris's grandparents were there. And one morning, Patty awoke to discover that someone had been in the house the night before. Dan was away. Somebody must have known he was away. And there was evidence that somebody had spent the rest of the night in their backyard behind a bush. She became convinced that Legere had been the mass killer, had been spending time in their backyard, maybe even invaded their house while they slept. After all, this would be some sort of sick triumph for Legere if he invaded the space of the police chief when he was away from home. So Patty, from that day, Chris's mom, lived in fear until Legere was finally captured. He tried to commandeer the car of a woman who just happened to be a off-duty policewoman. She got away from him, contacted her colleagues, and they arrested him, and the nightmare ended. The name Legere keeps coming up from time to time when he tries to apply for parole. Recently, he was denied. It's like a nightmare that keeps coming back and back and back. So that's the kind of, Chris grew up in an area of a family of law and order. He was very determined that good would triumph. And they were part of the stories that he grew up with, that and his friends and computers. And you probably saw this. I gave you this little glimpse. There's Chris, not a very good picture, but Chris and a buddy sitting before Chris's first computer in his home in Newcastle in the Miramichi. And on high school graduation, Chris moved away, a couple of hours away, to the city of Fredericton to attend the University of New Brunswick, which has a wonderful hillside campus, you may know, and it has a terrific computer science school. I think it's the first sort of separate computer science faculty in Canada. And I think it is actually the first engineering school, little known about the University of New Brunswick. And it had a great group of people. It was where Chris spent a number of years. Now, about that time, I think you have to remember that the politics was changing. Just before Chris got to New Brunswick, to University of New Brunswick, the politics had changed quite a bit in New Brunswick. And a man named a Miramichi lawyer, a Chatham, New Brunswick lawyer named Frank McKenna had become premier. And he was determined to change the narrative in the province. You may remember that. Not so much feeling sorry for itself, but progressive and with a global image as being a progressive province. And he really, like other premiers before, although back to Louis Robichaud in the beginning, he saw a very positive role for government in changing the narrative of New Brunswick. And he started allying with the local phone company, New Brunswick Telephone, NBTel. He began to take the internet to the cities, smaller cities of New Brunswick. He was really a pioneer in what we now know as rural broadband. And he actually paid subsidies to families for young people to have access to computers. He started a call center industry, which you may remember, call centers. It's a bit controversial even now, but there were jobs. And he dabbled in what we now know as e-government, electronic digital government, where you can do a lot of the things you need, such as licenses, right from your home computer or possibly a kiosk not far from your home, rather than going into a designated office. So really, he also subsidized, as in call centers, but he also changed the mindset of the province for a while. And he had partners with the local phone company. And when he left office in 1997, he left the province with a greater sense of itself, as well known in the world as being a progressive province. Unfortunately, tough economic conditions and the succession of premiers since then, it's been hard to maintain that momentum. But that was the kind of New Brunswick that Chris grew up in. And he met similar kids from New Brunswick when he was at UNB, blue collar kids, the sons of mechanics and cops and forestry workers. And they didn't have a lot of money. Those kids didn't, but they were good students, solid. Chris, by the way, you might be interested, he hated calculus. He was not a terrific student. He was a good student, but he was curious. And curiosity is almost trumps everything else. If you're curious, you could succeed where perhaps you're not a great academic. And he liked to fix things. He liked to work out, solve problems. There was not a lot of cash in the Newton family, so Chris was told he could quit as a full-time student at University of New Brunswick, and he could work for the university as a tech worker, and he could take courses on the side, eventually work off his degree over a longer period. So he became the kind of guy that if you were at University of New Brunswick in those days and you had a problem with your computer in about 1995 to 1999, Chris would come along and help you out. And problem was that this was the early days of university networks and the internet. And there was a lot of assaults by hackers. And they would unleash outside, sometimes inside. Hackers would unleash an onslaught of data that could overwhelm the university systems. And there was no way to stop it. Somebody said it was like if you had a mailbox that had a capacity for 10 letters and suddenly somebody deluged it with 1,000 letters. The system simply became overwhelmed. There was not the technology to deal with it, and it simply buckled under the weight. Now, in those days, Chris watched the older technologists at the university as they tried to cope with this in the University Computing Center, and he decided to work on it alone by himself. And he came up with a program in which, I'm no techie, but basically this is the way Chris describes it. The university tried to deal with every one of these pieces of data called packets as they flood into the network. Chris said, let's not look at the packets. Let's look at the flows of data, where the data comes from, where it goes. And he found out, he coded a system. You could map these flows of data through the university system. And he created something he could put on his screen, color coded, and it was kind of X-ray of the computer system, of the whole University of New Brunswick computer system, and where it's flaws, where its weak points, what was coming through, what was coursing through the system at that time. And he used this to great effect. There was a troll attack, an attack from inside on the computer. He was able to trace the problem to a single desk in a single lab in a single building, and trace the person who was the perpetrator. There was a visiting professor who was being attacked by a troll, and Chris helped in tracing the perpetrator to Australia, to a kid in Australia who was doing the attack. So it was a nice life for Chris. He was getting older. He was making some money. His love of cars. He had a girlfriend, thoughts of marriage, great career, working in the corridors of University of New Brunswick, and he had mentors and friends to help him out. His first car, a Miata, intensely proud of this car because he's a real gearhead. And 20 years ago, last fall, the people at University of New Brunswick saw what Chris had done, and they said, that's a good idea. This could be a product. So they invited Chris to a kind of show and tell for investors, people who might invest in some of the university's technology. They met at the Wu Center, which is the big center, exhibition center, conference center at UNB. And Chris was the only person at it, who was showing, demonstrating, who was under 40, the only one who was a non-academic, but he's a little shy because he's a shy kid. And he said, I don't think I should be here. But he met a local businessman named Brian Flood. Brian Flood came from St. John, and he was very interested in what Chris was doing, and Chris's life changed with that one meeting 20 years ago last fall. It became a collaboration. The kid and the veteran, Brian was 10 years older, and they were totally different people. Brian was larger than life. Chris was shy, a little uncertain, but it would change New Brunswick. They clicked. And a little bit about Brian Flood, from St. John, a good family. His father was a radiologist at the major hospital there. Brian had been an athlete. I think he majored in sports and minored in an actual academic program in business. And he came out of that with a great sense of competition. He worked for 3M in Western Canada, out of Edmonton. He came home because he wanted to own his own business, and he owned 2 franchises of the Don Cherry sports bar franchise. And remember Don Cherry? So Brian was a total different from Chris. He was an entrepreneur, and he thought that Chris's idea was the answer to his dreams. So the 2 of them became partners. The 2 became a team, and they recruited 2 of Chris's good friends from the university, Dwight Spencer and his other friend, Sandy Bird. And they were off on a great adventure. And they roped in the former head of the telephone company, a guy named Jerry Pond, to work with them. And the 5 of them set off on this great adventure in New Brunswick to create a company around Chris's great cybersecurity idea. And it was a big moment for Chris. This is Jerry Pond, the telephone company guy. This is Brian Flood, the larger than life partner. On the right-hand corner, Sandy Bird on the lower right-hand corner, Chris in the middle, and Dwight Spencer on the far left, on the lower far left. So they had become a team. Now, there's a moment when Chris wasn't sure about all this, and he was contemplating a family. His wife, Tracy, a school teacher. They were going to get married, and they had gotten married, actually, I think by that point. But the university, if he stayed with University of New Brunswick, Chris could have had a great career, nice career, stable salary, public sector pension at the end of the road. Now he is being offered by Brian, the guy in the upper right-hand corner, the opportunity to work with him on a startup, high risk. He could lose everything, or he could score the big windfall. He could become amazingly rich if he was one of the maybe 1% or 2% or 3%. I think maybe closer to 10% that actually can succeed at these things. He was on leave, Chris was, working on this big idea when his boss called one day and said to him, Chris, you got to make up your mind. Are you coming back with us, with the university, in the tech department, in the computer department, or are you going off on your own? It was a huge dilemma for Chris because he's security versus the great unknown. Then he was very troubled by this. Then his boss came back with another option. Chris, how about you take a 2-year leave of absence and try it out? And Chris said that changed everything. It meant that he had a comfort zone. He had a cushion. In a way, I think it's a lesson there for any institution which has smart young people or old people in its midst. We're Canadians. we kind of like a safety net. And if you want innovation, maybe you have to provide a little more safety net here in Canada than in other parts of the world. Anyway, Chris took the leave, and he never came back, of course, to the University of Brunswick. And he never got his degree. The shy kid from the Miramichi had become an entrepreneur. And New Brunswick in those days, as I told you, was mill towns, fisheries, mines, and forests. Two big families ran much of the business in the province, the Irvings and the McCains. There's a big French-English split, which often defines the political debate in the province. It's the only officially bilingual province, which means it's a great advantage sometimes, but it's a great debate about it in New Brunswick. And it's aging. Its population is getting older. More people of my age and less of Chris's age, and fewer of Chris's age. And many people who were coming to live in New Brunswick were coming home, were New Brunswickers coming home after careers in Calgary or Toronto, or and of course working in the oil sands of northern Alberta. And now there's this group of kids who are coming along who are changing the story, and they had a company called Q1 Labs. That's what Brian Flood had called it, named after Q, the great quartermaster of the James Bond series of movies. So Chris had his two buddies involved, Dwight and Sandy, as you can see, and it was very intense for them at the beginning. They were actually working at their old jobs for periods of time while they were coming home at 5:30 and working into the night on their new big idea, Chris's big idea. And it was often said, Chris used to say it was kind of funny, they'd be working till 1 o'clock. They had a little chat system back and forth among them. And every once in a while, you would see the keystrokes go in a line, L, 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 L. And they'd say to the, one would say to the other, oh, looks like Dwight has fallen asleep on his keyboard again. That was the life they were leading. And so Newton's message to young entrepreneurs, if you have any young entrepreneurs or old entrepreneurs, I suspect, like us, if it doesn't keep you awake at night, it's probably not worth doing. A great new idea can't be easy. Anything of value in technology, it has to be hard. So a lot of my book is about these 5 people and the chase for money, for sales, for talent. The role of women became more important. In the beginning, it was much like a lot of tech startups of that period. It was a guy culture, but they needed some skills, and the best skills happened to belong to a couple of women. They needed a strong operational skills of a woman named Marie-Jo Thibault from Quebec, who was at the UN at UNB, and Daniela DeGrasse, an Acadian engineer who was excellent at retaining customers, and they needed to keep customers. And they found financiers in the United States to back them. And it was a big move when on their 64th try, their 64th interview with venture capitalists, they finally landed financiers, and the company went on for about 10 more years, a bit of a struggle at times, until finally in 2011, the company was sold for $600 million to IBM, the US computer giant. $600 million US, so maybe $750 million Canadian. So that's what Chris created. Chris, from that little idea in the University of New Brunswick. But Chris was gone by then. Chris wasn't there. He was essentially fired by the company he had founded. All those long days and nights working on this, and the company and its American owners, the American investors who took it over, basically told Chris that he was excess, he was superfluous, and they had no loyalty to Chris or any of the other Canadian founders. The company's head office was moved to Boston, although the product development remained in Fredericton, I'm happy to say. So Chris was a heavy cost on the new owners. And for one thing, he didn't like to travel. He was building a family at that time. He didn't want to be didn't want to be away from home. He wasn't a natural salesman. And his friend Sandy was a natural salesman. And the company finally decided, the American owners, that they had to choose between Sandy and Chris, and Sandy was more valuable because he would go on the road and sell the product like mad. And they sold it largely to American institutions like Harvard University, Coca-Cola, Texas A&M, a whole raft of big US institutions, banks, Sun banks. Chris felt angry. He felt hurt. He felt pained. And yet he didn't take time to sulk because he was thinking about something else when he was fired. He was thinking about social media. It was the beginning of Facebook. It was just before the launch of Twitter. And the internet was alive with blogs and all kinds of chatter that had never been there before. And he was actually thinking about the idea of social media. As a son of a policeman, he discovered there was a dark world of pedophiles who communicated on the internet. And he had come up with a plan that he could monitor chat on the internet, a program that would keep track and would monitor and record and disclose to certain clients when there was certain types of chat on the internet. And he went to the police forces of Canada and he said, how about this? And the local RCMP in Fredericton, the detachment, said, we're not really thinking about that stuff these days. And besides, we don't have the money to pay for anything like that. I think 20 years later, they would probably have a different story now. They would have a different approach, but Chris was a little ahead of the time. But there were people who would pay for Chris's new idea. And that was corporations who wanted to monitor the chat of what people were saying about their products online. Procter & Gamble, AOL Time Warner, Dell Computers, whose computers in those days were having a little tendency to catch on fire. There was a huge social media talk on blogs about all the problems of Dell. If only Dell had a program that could monitor this conversation, they would be able to act quickly to respond to all this trouble. So Chris helped found another company called Radian 6 with the help of other colleagues. And it was a huge success right away. And it allowed Chris to work in the background in the lab, writing code, soaking up ideas, and he didn't have to go on the road. This was largely sold as a service off the internet. And that company, Chris's second company, Radian 6, was sold to Salesforce for $340 million US. So Chris immediately became New Brunswick's $1 billion man in terms of the value he created in those two companies for investors and a little bit of money for himself as well. He did quite well, not as well as the investors, of course, but never happens that way. But Chris did well. And he helped his mom, Patty, and her husband, new husband, for Dan had died in the interim, her new husband, buy a house in New Brunswick. So I decided to do a book on this phenomenon. And I started a conversation by email with Chris and by phone calls. And Chris directed me to his mom, who at that time, I went to visit her in a little town called Salisbury, New Brunswick, just outside Moncton, which until then had been famous for only one other thing. It had been the home of Rob Metcalf. So Patty Phillips had to sort of brush Rob Metcalf aside in terms of the notoriety. Anyway, Chris's mom, Patty Phillips, proud mom, she had clippings on the wall. Maybe you've seen pictures of Wayne Gretzky's father, Walter Gretzky's den with all the pictures and the trophies of Wayne through the years. Well, Patty had all the clippings of Chris, her son, now called Patty Phillips, but originally Patty Newton. And she had all the clippings. And you could see how Chris had become a celebrity in New Brunswick. And all kinds of magazines and newspapers wanted to do stories on Chris. There's Chris with his slightly taller colleague, Chris Ramsey, after they had struck it rich with Radian 6. And she told me how Chris had it all. He was on top of the world and would be employed for a couple of years with the new owner of the company, Salesforce. And he would probably leave them and start another company. He was a winner. He was on top of the world in terms of the wealth he had created. Chris needed medical insurance with sales if he was to stay with Salesforce. So he had to go to a doctor for a checkup. The doctor checked out that mole, that spot that had been on his back for quite a while. And the doctor said, we better get that checked. We better get that checked out. That spot on your back. Came back, stage 3 melanoma. So Chris was facing a different kind of challenges than technology. He'd been the subject of a media blitz at that time, but he was thinking more about his health. And he recalls that being interviewed by the Globe and Mail, by me, about that time in 2011. And this was a picture that ran with the story. I didn't know at the time that Chris was sick. And if you look, he looks a little uncomfortable here. And I realize why, because he says, basically, I just had a piece taken out of my back and the surgeries and staples. And I was in increasing discomfort. And I interviewed him. I said, God, this guy is really low key for a fellow who has just made a lot of people wealthy and has created an industrial presence in New Brunswick for technology. And Chris looked after, of course, his illness. He given the fact he was Canadian and given the fact he could afford a new immunotherapy treatment that coming out of the United States, he got the cancer under control. But here's the story. He walked away. He walked away from the tech world at that point, 2011. The kid who was on top of the world because his priorities were different. He took a look at his life and he took a break. He built his dream house along the river in St. John, or in Fredericton, west of the downtown Fredericton. He raised his 2 kids with his wife, and he just fell out of the limelight. And people would ask, whatever happened to Chris Newton? But he read. He continued to soak up that curiosity, continued to be a part of his life. So I asked Chris what he read about. And he said, I read about cameras, architecture, electric cars, drones, future of energy, smart homes, Raspberry Pi, and the maker movement, that movement that glorifies and refocuses on making things with your hands. So Chris was busy all the time. He took his time away from technology. Would he come back? Well, he kept in touch with his old friends. He remained curious about the technology world. And he's now about close to 50, late 40s, still with him, that interest. And I'm pleased to say that as I finished this book, the last research, I got in touch with Chris and he said, I'm coming back. There's a whole new generation of kids that I want to work with who can make this province different, can make an impact. A few of them, 3 of them, have founded a company called Potential Motors. They want to work with artificial intelligence on vehicle control, brakes and steering under difficult weather conditions. And where better to test difficult weather conditions than New Brunswick, particularly during a winter. And Chris has become the chief scientist, mentor. And remember that Chris and his friends, some of whom are involved in this company, they could have gone to California. They could have even gone to Toronto or Waterloo, but they decided to stay in New Brunswick to help build the next generation of startups and success. And that's what Chris has decided to do now. And he's got a long runway after all he's been through. So Chris lies at the heart of my book because his life story offers interesting lessons. Innovation comes in strange packages. Chris wasn't the smartest, the coolest kid, or the most unforgettable. He was a kid that maybe was halfway back in your high school class who didn't say a lot, but suddenly he would present a terrific paper and you said, oh yes, that kid's got something. And it's all about problem solving, not innate genius, not working by himself, always in the lab, but solving real world problems and off the beaten path, as I said. To research this book, I had to go a lot to Mars. the Technology Incubator Center at the corner of college and university. It's a wonderful place. You just sit there and you're blown away by these kids. You can actually hear the conversations if you strain to listen, and there's a deal being made or a kid talking to a venture capitalist, men and women, young men and women. But you can also find, you don't have to go downtown Toronto. You can find this kind of spirit in places like New Brunswick or Thunder Bay, Peterborough, Ontario, St. Thomas, Thunder Bay, as I say, but also the West, place like Saskatoon, Kelowna, places that are producing this kind of innovation. And I think it comes from the strength of a public education system, good teachers, great public universities that give everyone a chance. Everyone can make a difference. Wherever you start out your life, you can end up in a different place, or like Chris, you can end up in the same place doing good work. It's all luck and timing, but you have to be ready when the luck comes and the timing comes your way. And sometimes, unfortunately, life does disrupt the best of business plans, as it did with Chris, and as it did with a number of the people in my book, because Chris is not the only one I'm dealing with. He's really become an inspiration for a whole generation of people who are now following him. And that is my book in a nutshell. Thank you very much.